Viewer discretion is advised. This presentation contains discussions of human remains and sensitive medical topics that some may find disturbing. It was less than 10 inches long. Its body was frail, its skin a grayish color, and its head was grotesque, shaped like a giant onion or a pointed helmet. There were no visible ears, no discernible genitals, and its mouth was just a tiny vertical slit that never seemed to open. But the eyes were enormous, dark, almond-shaped pits that occupied most of the face, staring forward with an unnerving, vacant intensity. This was the creature found in a forgotten corner of Russia, a being so alien, so physically impossible, that it was given a gentle name that belied its terrifying appearance: Alyoshenka. For several weeks, this tiny entity was reportedly kept alive. It was fed, cradled, and cared for by an elderly woman who believed it was a gift from the stars. Then it died. And shortly after, it vanished. All that remains is a bizarre collection of grainy photographs, a single blurry video, and a story so riddled with contradictions and official denials that it reads like a Cold War fever dream. But the central mystery isn't just what this creature was. The real question, the one that points to something far more sinister, is what happened to its body. Why would a potential extraterrestrial specimen, arguably the most significant discovery in the history of science, be confiscated by local authorities and then simply disappear? What did they find that was so shocking, so dangerous, that they felt the need to erase it from existence? This is the story of the Kyshtym Dwarf, a case that is either the most compelling evidence of alien life ever documented, or one of the most tragic and misunderstood medical cases of the 20th century. And the answer may be buried in a town that was already cursed long before this creature ever appeared. To understand what happened in the summer of 1996, you first have to understand the place it happened. Kyshtym. It's a name that means nothing to most Americans, but to Russians it carries a chilling weight. This isn't just any remote town in the Ural Mountains. This is the heart of Russia's nuclear complex, a closed city that for decades was a secret on a classified map. It sits next to a place called Chelyabinsk 40, now known as Ozyorsk, home to the infamous Mayak plutonium plant. Think of it as Russia's Area 51, but with a much darker, deadlier secret. In 1957, this region became the site of the third worst nuclear disaster in history, an event so catastrophic it was kept hidden from the world by the Soviet Union for over 30 years. A massive explosion at the Mayak plant released a plume of radioactive poison that contaminated over 8,000 square miles of land. It was a silent, invisible apocalypse. The forests turned red, the rivers glowed, and the people got sick. They developed cancers, birth defects, and strange illnesses that doctors had never seen. The land itself was mutated, poisoned to its very core. This is the world Alyoshenka was born into, a radioactive wasteland, shrouded in government secrecy, where the line between science fiction and horrific reality had been blurred for decades. Was the creature a product of this poisoned earth? A human life twisted by radiation into something unrecognizable? Or was it something that fell from the sky, drawn to a place already familiar with strange, unexplained phenomena? Our story begins with a woman named Tamara Vasilievna Prosperina. By 1996, she was an elderly pensioner, living alone in the small village of Kalinovy, just outside Kyshtym. By many accounts, Tamara suffered from psychiatric challenges. She was known to her neighbors as a bit eccentric, a lonely woman who would sometimes talk to herself. And in August of that year, she began hearing a voice. A voice in her head, she claimed, that was calling to her, guiding her. It told her to go to the local cemetery. One stormy evening under a dark, oppressive sky, she followed the voice's command. She walked through the woods toward the burial ground, drawn by an irresistible urge. And there, near a cluster of trees, she found it. A tiny living creature, no bigger than a newborn kitten, wrapped in a scrap of red cloth. It was whimpering a faint, high-pitched squeak. It looked, she would later tell people, like a little alien. She picked it up, cradled it in her arms, and took it home. She named it Alyoshenka, a sweet, affectionate Russian name, and declared to anyone who would listen that it was her child. For the next 3 weeks, Tamara's small, simple apartment became a makeshift nursery for a being that defied all biological logic. She tried to feed it. She would mix a bit of milk with water, or offer it condensed milk and caramel on a tiny spoon. The creature's mouth was a small, unmoving slit, but somehow it seemed to absorb the nutrients. It never chewed, it never defecated, but it remained alive. Tamara would swaddle it in blankets, whisper to it, and protect it fiercely. Of course, the neighbors were concerned. They saw Tamara's obsession and worried for her mental state. But their concern turned to shock when they actually saw the creature for themselves. Tamara's daughter-in-law, also named Tamara, came to visit. She later described her utter disbelief. She saw the little being lying on the bed. It wasn't a doll. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. She said its head was like a dark brown onion, and it had no eyelids, just those huge unblinking eyes. It would occasionally let out a soft whistle or a squeak when it was hungry. She was terrified, but she also saw that her mother-in-law was genuinely caring for it. Another witness, a man named Vladimir Nertinov, was a local who knew Tamara. He recalled being in her apartment and seeing Alyoshenka. He said it was lying on the bed, looking around the room. It didn't look human. The shape of the skull, the eyes, the lack of any familiar features, it was completely alien to him. He was convinced it was not of this world. The story began to spread through the small community. People were skeptical, but those who claimed to have seen it were adamant. This was not a deformed animal or a child's toy. It was a living, breathing entity, and no one knew what it was. The local policeman, Vladimir Bendlin, heard the rumors. He was initially dismissive, chalking it up to village gossip and the ramblings of an unstable old woman. But the reports were persistent enough that he felt he had to at least look into it. He had no idea he was about to step into the middle of a mystery that would consume his life. But before Bendlin could investigate, the situation took a tragic turn. Tamara Prosperina's mental health deteriorated. Her neighbors, worried about her increasingly erratic behavior, called for a psychiatric evaluation. An ambulance arrived and took her away to a local hospital for observation. In her confused state, she tried to tell the doctors about her child, about Alyoshenka, but no one believed her. They dismissed it as a delusion, a fantasy born of loneliness and illness. She was hospitalized, leaving the tiny, helpless creature all alone in her apartment. No one was there to feed it. No one was there to care for it. And what happened next is where the story shifts from a strange local curiosity to a potential cover-up. Because while Tamara was locked away, her child died. And its death was only the beginning of its journey. The apartment fell silent. With Tamara Prosperina gone, committed to a psychiatric facility against her will, the tiny being she called Alyoshenka was completely alone. It's a haunting image to consider. This creature, whatever it was, dependent on Tamara for its survival, now lay helpless in an empty room. The details of its final days are bleak and shrouded in uncertainty. Some say a friend of Tamara's, who had been checking in, simply stopped coming. Others whisper that the neighbors, disturbed by the constant, strange chirping sounds, finally just ignored them. The most likely and most tragic explanation is that it starved. It was a life that began in mystery and ended in neglect, a small, fragile existence snuffed out by circumstance. But the body remained, and it was the body that would become the true epicenter of this entire saga. News in a small town like Kyshtym travels fast, especially strange news. Whispers of Tamara's alien baby had already been circulating, treated mostly as the sad ramblings of a troubled woman. But now, with Tamara gone, the story took on a new life. It reached the ears of a man named Vladimir Nertinov. Nertinov was not a scientist or a researcher. He was a local man, known to the police for petty theft and a history of drinking. He was an opportunist. And when he heard that the source of these bizarre rumors was now lying dead and unguarded in an empty apartment, he saw a chance. He wasn't thinking about science or discovery. He was thinking about money. Nertinov broke into Tamara's apartment, and there it was, lying still and lifeless. It was even stranger in death than the rumors described. The body was already beginning to desiccate in the dry air of the apartment. Nertinov, perhaps realizing that a decomposing body was worthless, decided to preserve it. His methods were crude, almost primitive. He didn't use formaldehyde or any scientific techniques. Instead, he washed the tiny corpse in alcohol and then laid it out to dry in the sun on his roof. For weeks, the Russian sun baked the little body, mummifying it, turning its skin a dark, leathery brown and preserving its bizarre features in perfect, startling detail. The large, elongated head, the huge, vacant eye sockets, the tiny, fragile limbs. He wrapped his prize in a red cloth, a strange sort of shroud for a creature of unknown origin. Now he had a product, a curiosity he could sell, and he started trying to do just that. Nurtanov began showing the mummified creature to people, hoping to find a buyer. He was clumsy about it, indiscreet. He'd show up at someone's house, unwrap the red cloth, and present this tiny alien-looking mummy, asking for cash. You can imagine the reactions: shock, disgust, fear, but also intense curiosity. With every person he showed it to, the legend of the Kyshtym Dwarf grew. It was no longer just a rumor about Tamara Prosperina's delusion. Now there was physical evidence. A body. And this brazen attempt to sell it is what finally escalated the situation from a local ghost story to an official police matter. The case landed on the desk of Major Vladimir Bendlin. Bendlin was a serious, no-nonsense police investigator. He was a man who dealt in facts, evidence, and the grim realities of human crime. When he first heard the reports, a man trying to sell a mummified alien, he was deeply skeptical. His first thought wasn't extraterrestrial. His first thought was that this was a terrible, tragic human crime. Was this the body of a premature infant born with deformities? Had Nurtanov found or stolen the remains of a miscarried fetus? To Bendlin, this was a potential homicide investigation, or at the very least, a case of desecrating a corpse. The alien story was just a bizarre cover for something much darker and much more familiar. He opened an official investigation, not into a UFO, but into the strange object in Vladimir Nurtanov's possession. But the police weren't the only ones who caught wind of Nurtanov's mummy for sale. The story also reached a very different kind of investigator. Galina Semenkova was the head of a local UFO research organization called the Star Academy of Ufology, Contact by the Ural Method. They were a group of passionate believers, convinced that humanity was not alone in the universe, and that evidence of alien visitation was all around us, just waiting to be found. For them, the news of the Kyshtym creature wasn't a potential crime. It was a potential breakthrough, the confirmation of everything they believed. They saw this not as a tragedy, but as a miracle, a genuine extraterrestrial biological entity, found right there in their region. They knew they had to get to it before the authorities did. They feared that if the police or the government got their hands on it, the body would be confiscated, classified, and hidden away from the world forever. Another Roswell, another cover-up. So now the stage was set for a confrontation. On one side, you have Major Bendlin and the Kyshtym police, methodically building their case against Nurtanov, preparing to raid his home and seize the body as evidence in a potential criminal investigation. They are driven by procedure, skepticism, and the law. On the other side, you have Galina Semenkova and her ufologists, desperately trying to track down Nurtanov first. They want to buy or borrow the body to conduct their own tests, to photograph it, to prove to the world that aliens are real. They are driven by belief, passion, and a deep distrust of authority. And caught in the middle is Vladimir Nurtanov, a petty criminal completely out of his depth, holding a mummified creature that could be the key to understanding our place in the universe, or could just be the evidence that sends him to prison. The race was on. Major Bendlin was closing in. He had an address. He had his suspect. He was just waiting for the right moment to move in and retrieve what he believed were the tragic remains of a human child. He intended to give the body a proper examination, perhaps even a proper burial. But what he didn't know was that his every move was being watched. The ufologists had their own sources, their own network. They knew the police were getting close. Time was running out. The fate of this tiny, silent witness, the creature known as Alyoshenka, now rested on who would get to it first. The skeptic or the believer. The answer would determine whether it became evidence in a crime or evidence of life beyond Earth. And the clock was ticking. The apartment fell silent. The frantic energy of Tamara Prosperina's last moments at home had evaporated, leaving behind only the stale air and the accumulated dust of a life lived on the fringes. But something else remained. Tucked away in the shadows, wrapped in a red rag, lay the secret she had tried to protect. For now it was safe. But in a small town like Kyshtym, secrets have a short lifespan. The first person to break the silence wasn't a police officer or a government agent. It was a man named Vladimir Nurtanov. He was a lodger, renting a room in Tamara's apartment to be closer to his work. He'd seen the creature. He'd heard Tamara call it Alyoshenka. He knew it wasn't just a doll or a pet. And now Tamara was gone and he was worried. He'd been arrested himself for a minor theft and had just been released. When he returned to the apartment, he found it empty. He called out for Tamara, but there was no answer. He knew about her struggles, her trips to the psychiatric hospital. He suspected she'd been taken away again. But his immediate concern wasn't for his landlady. It was for the tiny, helpless being she had been caring for. He went to her room. The place was a mess, but he knew where to look. He found the small bundle, unwrapped the red cloth, and his heart sank. Alyoshenka was dead. The creature was no longer the soft, pliable being he had seen before. It was stiff, discolored. It had clearly been dead for some time, likely succumbing to starvation or dehydration after its caretaker was forcibly removed. Nurtinov was faced with a bizarre and terrifying problem. What do you do with the dead? What? He couldn't just throw it away. But who could he possibly call? He made a decision that would change everything. He called the police. In the drab, functional offices of the Kyshtym Police Department, Major Vladimir Bendlin was a man who had seen his share of provincial crime. Drunks, petty thieves, domestic disputes. That was the rhythm of his daily life. He was a serious, by-the-book investigator, a man grounded in the hard realities of post-Soviet Russia. So when a call came in about a man wanting to turn over a mummy he'd found in his apartment, Bendlin's first reaction was likely a sigh of weary disbelief. Another drunk, another tall tale. Still, a call had to be answered. He dispatched an officer to check it out. The report that came back was anything but ordinary. The officer confirmed there was a body, a very, very strange body. Intrigued, Bendlin decided to go himself. He arrived at Tamara's apartment and was met by Nurtinov, who nervously handed over the small mummified corpse. Bendlin took it. He looked down at the thing in his hands. It was about 10 inches long, dark and leathery from desiccation. Its head was grotesquely oversized, shaped almost like a helmet or an onion dome with a pointed crown. The eye sockets were enormous, occupying a huge portion of the face. There was no discernible nose, only 2 small holes. The mouth was a tiny slit. Its limbs were thin, its fingers and toes long and slender. Bendlin was a cop. His mind was trained to see evidence, to construct logical narratives from chaos. And his first thought was a grim one. This was a human fetus, a victim of a secret illegal abortion, a crime he was now obligated to investigate. Tamara Prosperina wasn't just a mentally ill old woman. She was now the prime suspect in a potential infanticide. He began a formal investigation. He took statements from neighbors. They spoke of Tamara's strange behavior, her claims of having a child from the stars. It all painted a picture of a disturbed woman, perhaps one who had a stillborn, deformed child and in her delusion, believed it was an alien. It was a tragic but terrestrial explanation. It made sense. And yet, the more Bendlin looked at the body, the more that simple explanation began to fray at the edges. There were things that just didn't add up. The shape of the skull was unlike anything he had ever seen. The bone structure seemed wrong. The proportions were alien, even for a severely deformed fetus. He needed an expert opinion. He took the mummified creature to the local hospital and showed it to a pathologist, Dr. Irina Yermolieva. He laid the body on her examination table and asked the simple question, "What is it?" Dr. Yermolieva was as baffled as he was. She examined the tiny corpse, her medical training running up against a biological impossibility. She noted the number of bones, the structure of the skull, the fontanelle, the soft spot on a baby's head, was completely absent. The skull was composed of only 4 plates, not the 6 found in a human. She saw features that were vaguely human, but the totality of the creature was something else entirely. She couldn't classify it. She told Bendlin with professional certainty that it did not appear to be human, nor did it seem to be any known animal. She suggested further, more sophisticated analysis was needed. Bendlin was now in an impossible position. He had a potential crime, but no identifiable victim. He had a body that the local medical expert couldn't identify. He had a file open, a case number assigned, but the central piece of evidence defied every category he understood. So he did what any cop would do when faced with unclassifiable evidence. He put it in a bag and stored it in the office freezer, next to the frozen lunches and confiscated vodka. But in a town like Kyshtym, a story this strange doesn't stay frozen for long. It began to leak out. Whispers of the Kyshtym alien, started to circulate through the city's factories and apartment blocks. A cop had found a tiny alien body. An old woman had been its mother. The story was a perfect piece of modern folklore, and it began to travel. It traveled beyond Kyshtym, reaching the ears of people who were actively searching for exactly this kind of story. Far away, an organization called Cosmopoisk, or Space Search, took notice. Led by a charismatic and determined researcher named Vadim Chernobrov, Cosmopoisk was Russia's premier UFO and paranormal investigation group. They weren't just hobbyists. They were organized, they had scientific advisors, and they approached their cases with methodical rigor. When they heard the rumors from the Ural Mountains, they knew it was different. This wasn't just a blurry photo or a shaky eyewitness account. This was a body, a physical specimen, the potential holy grail of ufology. Chernobrov mobilized his team. They had to get to Kyshtym. They had to see the body for themselves, to secure it for scientific study before it was lost or dismissed by a skeptical bureaucracy. While Vladimir Bendlin was trying to figure out how to fit this anomaly into the neat boxes of a criminal investigation, a completely different kind of investigator was now heading his way. The two worlds were on a collision course. On one side, a state official, bound by law and procedure, holding onto a piece of evidence he couldn't explain. On the other, a passionate believer, a seeker of cosmic truths, racing towards what he hoped was the discovery of a lifetime. And in the middle, frozen and silent, was Alyoshenka. The body was about to become the prize in a tug-of-war between two fundamentally different realities. Bendlin, the grounded policeman, was about to find his case file hijacked. He thought he was investigating a local crime. He had no idea he was now the gatekeeper to a global mystery. The believers were coming, and they wanted his evidence. The first to arrive was a woman named Galina Semenkova. She wasn't a journalist or a government official. She was something else entirely. Semenkova was the head of an organization from the nearby city of Kamensk-Uralsky, a group that called itself the Star Academy of UFO Contact in the Ural-Siberian zone. It was a grand, almost science fiction title for what was essentially a small, devoted band of UFO enthusiasts and researchers. They had heard the whispers coming out of Kyshtym, murmurs of a strange creature, a lost old woman, and a police force in possession of something inexplicable. For Semenkova and her associates, this wasn't just a bizarre local news story. It was a signal. It was the potential culmination of everything they believed in, everything they searched the skies for. They descended on the Kyshtym police department not with the skepticism of reporters, but with the fervor of pilgrims arriving at a holy site. They found Vladimir Bendlin, a man thoroughly unimpressed with their cosmic theories. He was a policeman dealing with what he still considered at its core a human tragedy. He had a body in his freezer. A tiny, strange body, yes, but one that was likely connected to the sad, confused woman who was now dead. To him, this was evidence. It was part of an investigation. It was not a messiah from another star system. Semenkova, however, was a force of nature. She didn't see a piece of evidence, she saw a visitor. She didn't see a confused local cop, she saw an obstacle. She explained to Bendlin, with an unnerving intensity, that he didn't understand what he had. She spoke of cosmic importance, of a breakthrough for all mankind. She argued that a standard autopsy by a standard pathologist would be a desecration. They wouldn't know what to look for. They would dismiss it, misclassify it, or worse, the government would seize it and it would disappear into a black site vault forever. Bendlin listened, his arms crossed, his face a mask of professional stoicism. He dealt with all kinds: drunks, thieves, liars, and now alien hunters. His training, his instincts, everything told him to follow procedure. The body needed to go to the morgue. A forensic pathologist needed to examine it. Paperwork needed to be filed. That was the law. That was the real world. But Semenkova was persistent. She wasn't just some crackpot. She was articulate, passionate, and she had an answer for everything. She told him her organization had access to scientists, to experts who specialized in anomalous biology. They could conduct tests that the state wouldn't even think of. They would treat the body with the respect it deserved, as the first confirmed ambassador from another world. Imagine Bendlin's position. He's a small-town cop in a forgotten corner of Russia. The official system is slow, bureaucratic, and often indifferent. He's got this thing in his evidence freezer, and no one in his chain of command seems to care. The only people who do care are this group of ufologists, who who are treating it like the discovery of the century. Days turned into a week. Semenkova and her team were relentless. They called. They showed up at the station. They pleaded. They presented evidence from other cases, blurry photos and convoluted theories. And somewhere, deep down, perhaps a sliver of doubt began to creep into Bendlin's mind. He had seen the creature with his own eyes. It wasn't normal. The triangular head, the huge, emotionless eyes, the tiny, unformed body. What if he sent it to the morgue and they just lost it? Or incinerated it as medical waste? What if these people, as strange as they were right? The weight of the decision was immense. He was just one man, a local investigator, and he was holding something that could either be a tragic birth defect or proof that we are not alone in the universe. In a move that would forever alter the course of this story, a decision he would likely question for the rest of his life, Vladimir Bendlin gave in. He made a choice that no police manual in the world would ever condone. He agreed to hand over the body. He rationalized it. He told Semenkova it was a loan. He videotaped the entire transaction, documenting her signing a makeshift chain of custody form, making her promise to return the body upon request. He was trying to maintain a shred of official procedure in a situation that had gone completely off the rails. And so, in the cold, sterile environment of the Kyshtym police station, a handover of potentially monumental significance took place. Bendlin retrieved the small, mummified form, still wrapped in the red cloth Tamara Prosperina had used. He passed it to Galina Semenkova. In that moment, the Kyshtym Dwarf, or Alyoshenka, as it was now affectionately known, left the world of official investigation and entered the realm of fringe science and true believers. The evidence was no longer in police custody. Semenkova received the body as if it were a sacred relic. Her demeanor was one of utter reverence. She and her team carefully placed the small bundle into a container and left Kyshtym, speeding back towards their headquarters. For them, this was a victory beyond their wildest dreams. They hadn't just found a story, they had secured the proof. Their first call was to a man they trusted, a local pathologist named Stanislav Samishkin. While Samishkin was a qualified medical professional, he was also sympathetic to the work of the Star Academy. He was one of the few people they knew who had both the scientific training to conduct an examination and the open mind to consider an extraordinary origin. They brought the body to him. Under the lights of his laboratory, far from the dusty village of Kalininovi, Alyoshenka was unwrapped once more. Samishkin began his examination. He was methodical, professional. He noted the size, just under 10 inches. He noted the mummified state of the tissues. But then he started to see the anomalies. The skull was the most striking feature. It was composed of only 4 cranial plates, unlike a human's 6. The helmet-like shape was utterly bizarre. There was no discernible navel, a biological impossibility for any placental mammal. The bone structure, the joints, the proportions, everything was subtly or in some cases radically wrong. Semenkova and her team watched, holding their breath. They had their beliefs, their hopes. But this was the first real scientific analysis. This was the moment of truth. Samishkin worked for hours measuring, probing, documenting. Finally, he stepped back, pulling off his gloves. He looked at Semenkova, his face grim, not with horror, but with the weight of a profound conclusion. He delivered his verdict. Based on the totality of the anatomical evidence, the number of cranial bones, the lack of a navel, the skeletal structure, he could state with professional certainty that the creature he had just examined was not human. He went even further. He said it bore no resemblance to any known species on Earth. He suggested it might be an extraterrestrial biological entity. The words hung in the air, electric. It was everything the ufologists had dared to hope for. This wasn't just a theory anymore. It wasn't a blurry photo or a shaky eyewitness account. This was a body that a trained pathologist had just declared to be alien. They had it. They had the smoking gun of ufology, the ultimate proof that had eluded humanity for generations. In their hands, they held a visitor from the stars. Now, the only question was, what on earth were they going to do with it? The ufologists from the Star Academy of UFO Contactology had their prize. They unwrapped the red cloth to reveal the tiny mummified creature. It was even stranger up close. The skin was leathery and brown, stretched tight over a delicate bird-like skeleton. The head was the most shocking part. It wasn't just large, It was shaped like a helmet or an onion dome tapering to a point. The eye sockets were huge, dominating the tiny face. There was no discernible nose, just two small holes. And the mouth was a tiny horizontal slit, incapable of forming words, but forever fixed in a silent cosmic scream. Galina Semenkova, the leader of the group, knew this was the discovery of a lifetime. This wasn't a story, a blurry photo, or a strange light in the sky. This was a body. Physical, tangible proof. They documented it meticulously, taking photographs from every angle, measuring its bizarre proportions. It was just under 10 inches long. They noted the strange crest on its head and the lack of any visible reproductive organs or a navel. An alien, they concluded, had to be born differently. Perhaps it was grown or cloned, not birthed in the human sense. Every anomaly, every deviation from human anatomy, was another point on the scoreboard for the extraterrestrial hypothesis. They kept their discovery quiet at first. This kind of evidence was dangerous. It could be confiscated by the government, ridiculed by the scientific establishment, or stolen by rival investigators. For a few precious weeks, the body of Alyoshenka was their secret, a holy relic of contact from another world. They stored it carefully, refrigerated to preserve its delicate state. They had plans, big plans. They would present it to the world, but on their own terms with irrefutable proof. But in a small town like Kyshtym, secrets have a short shelf life. Whispers of Tamara's alien baby had already been circulating, and now rumors of a strange mummified body in the hands of local UFO hunters began to spread like wildfire. And those rumors eventually reached the desk of the local police department, specifically, an officer named Vladimir Bendlin. Bendlin was not your typical small-town cop. He was inquisitive, open-minded, and had a quiet fascination with the unexplained. When he heard the stories, first of the crazy old woman and her alien, and then of the UFO group possessing a strange body, he didn't just dismiss them. He saw a thread, a bizarre but consistent narrative that demanded a proper investigation. His primary concern at first wasn't aliens. It was the possibility of a crime. Was this the body of an abandoned infant? A victim of some terrible undiscovered tragedy? He decided to pay Galina Semenkova a visit. When Bendlin arrived at Semenkova's apartment, the atmosphere was tense. He wasn't there to mock them. He was there in his official capacity as a police officer. He explained his duty to investigate, and after some initial reluctance, Semenkova and her group agreed to show him the body. They likely felt that cooperating with the police would add a layer of legitimacy to their discovery. Bendlin stared at the tiny figure. He'd seen a lot in his line of work, but nothing like this. It was undeniably real, but it looked like something from a science fiction movie. He knew instantly that this was far beyond his expertise. He couldn't just file this away. This needed to be examined by professionals. He made a decision that would change the course of the entire story. He confiscated the body. Semenkova and her team were horrified. Their proof, their discovery, was being taken away by the authorities. They protested, but they had no choice. Bendlin carefully wrapped the mummified creature and took it with him, promising a full forensic investigation. The smoking gun of ufology was now evidence in a potential and very strange police case. Bendlin's first stop was the local hospital. He needed an expert opinion, someone who could tell him what he was looking at. He sought out the head of the pathology department, Dr. Stanislav Samishkin. Samishkin was a man of science, a man who dealt in the hard, cold facts of human biology and death. Bendlin presented the body to him, and the pathologist began his examination. What Samishkin saw was, without question, the strangest specimen of his career. He noted the same features the ufologists had: the tiny stature, the leathery skin, the bizarrely shaped skull. But where the ufologists saw an alien, Samishkin saw something else. He saw a tragedy of biology. His preliminary conclusion was shocking, but grounded in medical science. He believed the Kyshtym Dwarf was not an alien. It was a human fetus, a premature baby, likely around 20 to 25 weeks of gestation, suffering from an almost unbelievable number of severe congenital deformities. He explained the science to Bendlin. The helmet-shaped head? That could be a result of hydrocephalus, water on the brain, combined with other skeletal malformations. The tiny, underdeveloped limbs, the strange facial structure, all of it, he argued, could be explained by a cascade of genetic mutations. And what could cause such horrific mutations? Samishkin had a chillingly plausible theory. Kyshtym. The town itself was the clue. Kyshtym is located in the Chelyabinsk Oblast, a region infamous for one of the worst nuclear disasters in history before Chernobyl. In 1957, a storage tank at the Mayak plutonium production plant, just a few miles away, exploded. The Kyshtym disaster, as it came to be known, released a massive plume of radioactive contamination over thousands of square miles. For decades, the population was exposed to dangerously high levels of radiation. The result was a spike in cancer rates, birth defects, and all manner of horrific health problems. To Samishkin, Alyoshenka wasn't a visitor from another planet, it was a victim of this one. A human child so profoundly damaged by the radioactive legacy of its own birthplace that it was born looking like something other. It was a terrestrial explanation that was, in its own way, more horrifying than an extraterrestrial one. It meant that our own mistakes, our own poisons could create monsters. The case seemed to be solved. A tragic misunderstanding. The alien from the stars was actually a ghost of the Cold War, a casualty of the nuclear age. Bendlin had his answer, but he wasn't entirely convinced. And neither were the ufologists, who heard of the pathologist's conclusion with outrage. They argued that the fetus theory didn't explain everything. Where was the umbilical cord? A 25-week-old fetus would have one. Why was the body so perfectly mummified, not decomposed, if it had been found in the woods? And Tamara Prosperina had insisted it was alive, that it ate and drank and made little whistling sounds. A fetus with such severe deformities would be unlikely to survive outside the womb for more than a few minutes, let alone weeks. Bendlin was caught in the middle. On one hand, he had a respected pathologist offering a sound scientific explanation. On the other, he had eyewitness testimony and a body with features that just didn't quite add up. He felt that Samishkin's examination, while valuable, wasn't enough. It was just a visual inspection. To truly solve the mystery, they needed more. They needed genetic testing. They needed a DNA analysis to prove, once and for all, if the creature was human or something else entirely. He decided to take the investigation to the next level. He made arrangements to transport the body to a more advanced forensic facility in the nearby city of Ekaterinburg. He carefully stored the mummified creature in his office refrigerator, inside the evidence locker, waiting for the transfer. The truth was finally within reach. The ultimate question, human or not human, was about to be answered by science. But the truth would have to wait. Because when Vladimir Bendlin went to retrieve the body, he opened his evidence locker and found nothing. The refrigerator was empty. The body of Alyoshenka, the single most important piece of evidence in the strangest case of his career, had vanished without a trace. The silence of the empty refrigerator was deafening. A cold dread, colder than the metal box itself, washed over Major Bendlin. He checked again, his hands tracing the empty shelf where the small mummified body had been just hours before. It was gone. The lock on the evidence room door hadn't been forced. There were no signs of a break-in. It was as if Alyoshenka had simply ceased to exist. Bendlin's mind raced. He launched a frantic, unofficial inquiry within the department. He questioned the night duty officers, the janitors, anyone who had been in the building. No one saw a thing. No one heard a thing. It was a perfect, impossible crime. In the vacuum of evidence, speculation took root and began to grow like a toxic weed. To Bendlin, there was only one explanation that made any sense, as insane as it sounded. The UFOs had come back. They had retrieved their own. He imagined a silent, glowing ship hovering over the police station, its occupants passing through walls like ghosts to reclaim their lost comrade. It was a story straight out of science fiction, but in the face of a vanishing body from a locked room, what was real anymore? This theory, the idea of an alien retrieval mission, was exactly what the burgeoning community of Russian ufologists wanted to hear. And they were already on their way to Kyshtym. News of the creature had spread through paranormal circles, and at the forefront was a charismatic and determined investigator named Galina Semenkova. As the head of a UFO research organization called the Star Academy, Semenkova and her team descended on the small town like a whirlwind. They weren't just researchers, they were believers. And they saw in Alyoshenka the proof they had been searching for their entire lives. They began their own investigation, parallel to the police's. They re-interviewed everyone, Tamara Prosperina's relatives, her neighbors, the paramedics. But their questions were different from Bendlin's. They weren't asking what people saw. They were asking about strange lights in the sky, about missing time, about odd feelings and premonitions. They were building a narrative piece by piece that placed Alyoshenka not at the center of a human tragedy, but at the heart of a galactic event. And then, the story of the body's disappearance from the police station reached them. For Semenkova, this wasn't a setback, it was the ultimate confirmation. Of course the body was gone. People had come for it. It was the final irrefutable piece of the puzzle. The official authorities, she claimed, were either incompetent or, more likely, complicit. They were pawns in a much larger game. A cosmic conspiracy to keep humanity in the dark. This is where the story fractures into two competing realities. On one side, you have Major Bendlin, a grounded police officer who, despite his own wild suspicions, was trying to follow procedure. He was now facing a stolen piece of evidence and a case that was spiraling out of control. On the other side, you had Galina Semenkova, who was broadcasting a story of alien contact and government cover-ups to anyone who would listen. The media naturally loved her version more. It was sensational, exciting, and terrifying. The tension between the two investigations reached a boiling point. Bendlin, growing increasingly frustrated, started to develop a new theory. What if the aliens hadn't taken the body? What if the government hadn't swooped in? What if the people who stood to gain the most from this story, being extraterrestrial, were the very ones who made the evidence disappear? He began to suspect Semenkova and her Star Academy. Think about it. As long as the body existed, it could be tested. A proper scientific autopsy could be performed. DNA could be sequenced. And what if the results came back human? What if this alien was nothing more than a tragically deformed human fetus? That single scientific fact would instantly destroy the entire narrative Semenkova was building. Her fame, her organization's credibility, the entire Kyshtym alien legend, it would all evaporate. But with the body gone, the mystery could live forever. With no body, there could be no proof. There could only be stories, theories, and belief. The disappearance didn't just preserve the mystery. It made it infinitely more powerful. Bendlin confronted members of the ufologist community. He accused them of orchestrating the theft, of stealing the body from his evidence locker to protect their narrative. They, of course, denied it vehemently. They fired back with their own accusations, painting Bendlin as a government stooge, a man tasked with discrediting them and suppressing the truth. They claimed that the FSB, Russia's powerful state security agency, was the real culprit. They argued that the body of Alyoshenka was now deep in a secret underground lab, being studied by scientists who would never reveal their findings to the public. It became a war of words, a battle for the truth fought in the pages of tabloids and on local television. Who do you believe? The frustrated cop who lost his only piece of evidence? Or the passionate UFO hunter who claimed to be fighting for cosmic disclosure? The public was divided. The story was now a modern myth, a campfire tale where you could choose your own villain. But Semenkova's group had an ace up their sleeve. While they didn't have the body, they claimed to have the next best thing. During their investigation, before the body vanished, they had managed to secure a crucial piece of evidence from Bendlin's office, the small, stained piece of cloth that Alyoshenka had been wrapped in. This scrap of fabric was now their Rosetta Stone. They claimed to have conducted their own scientific analysis on the cloth. The results, they announced, were earth-shattering. They reported finding biological material on the fabric that contained DNA unlike anything known on Earth. They spoke of amino acids that didn't conform to our planet's biology. This was their proof. The body may be gone, they said, but its alien essence remains, soaked into these threads. For believers, this was everything. The cloth became a sacred relic. But for skeptics, it was just another unverified claim from an organization with a clear agenda. Who performed these tests? Where was the lab? Where was the peer-reviewed data? The answers were always vague, wrapped in the language of conspiracy and secrecy. For years, this is where the trail went cold. The case was a maddening stalemate. A missing body, a contested piece of cloth, two warring narratives, an alien visitor or a government cover-up. Major Bendlin eventually retired, the case of the Kyshtym Dwarf remaining the most bizarre and unresolved chapter of his career. Galina Semenkova and the Star Academy continued to champion the story, cementing Alyoshenka as a legend in the annals of ufology. The truth seemed destined to remain lost, a casualty of belief, suspicion, and a perfectly executed, unexplained theft. But the story wasn't over, because that little piece of cloth, the one Semenkova's group held onto so tightly, would eventually find its way into the hands of impartial mainstream geneticists. Years after the chaos and the accusations, long after the world had mostly forgotten the strange tale from a small industrial town in the Urals, science was about to have its say. A team of Russian scientists from the Institute of General Genetics in Moscow got a sample, and they were about to conduct a definitive DNA test, one that promised to finally answer the question once and for all: alien body or tragic misunderstanding. The truth was locked in the genetic code, waiting, and the results they found would be more shocking and more tragic than anyone could have ever imagined. The weight of expectation fell upon the shoulders of geneticists at the prestigious Vavilov Institute of General Genetics in Moscow. This wasn't some tabloid-funded fringe lab. This was one of Russia's most respected scientific institutions. The sample they received was small, degraded, and shrouded in a story that bordered on the absurd. But science deals in data, not stories. Their task was to cut through the noise, through the UFO sightings and the psychic premonitions, and get to the biological truth of the creature known as Alyoshenka. The process was painstaking. Extracting a viable genetic sample from a mummified, decades-old specimen is a monumental challenge. The DNA is like a fragile, ancient scroll that has been left out in the rain. It frays, it breaks apart, it gets contaminated by every hand that's touched it, every dust mote in the air. The scientists had to meticulously clean their samples, using advanced techniques to isolate the original genetic material from all the modern-day contamination. They were hunting for a genetic ghost. And when the first results came back from the sequencer, a stunned silence fell over the lab. The data was confusing, anomalous. Certain genetic markers, the very signposts that identify a species, were unlike anything they had on record. The mitochondrial DNA, passed down from the mother, showed familiar human patterns, but the nuclear DNA, the core blueprint of the individual, was a chaotic mess. It was human, yes, but it was profoundly and fundamentally wrong. There were gene deletions, duplications, and translocations on a scale they had never seen in a viable birth. Imagine trying to read a book where 20% of the letters are missing, another 10% are printed backwards, and entire paragraphs have been cut from one chapter and pasted randomly into another. That's what they were looking at. The initial analysis was so baffling that for a short, thrilling moment, the impossible seemed possible. The data was so strange, so far outside the norms of human biology, that the scientists couldn't definitively rule out the unknown species hypothesis. The genetic code was so shattered, so alien in its structure, that it almost looked engineered, or perhaps truly not of this world. This was the moment the ufologists had been waiting for. The preliminary findings leaked, as they always do, and the community was electric. This was it. Scientific proof. The Vavilov Institute, a bastion of sober science, was on the brink of confirming that an alien had lived and died in the Ural Mountains. The story of Tamara Prosperina and her tiny star child was about to be vindicated. But real science is not about jumping to the most exciting conclusion. It's about doubt. It's about testing and retesting. The team at the Vavilov Institute, led by Dr. Stanislav Samishkin, refused to be swayed by the sensationalism. They knew something was profoundly unusual, but they couldn't accept the extraterrestrial answer without exhausting every other possibility. So they went deeper. They ran the sequences again. They used more powerful computers and more sophisticated algorithms to try and piece together the fragmented genetic sentence. Slowly, painstakingly, a new picture began to emerge from the static. It was a far more terrestrial and a far more horrifying picture. As they managed to reconstruct more and more of the genome, they realized they weren't looking at an alien. They were looking at a human female, but one who had been dealt the single worst genetic hand imaginable. The final report was a catalog of biological devastation. The child, for she was a human child, had suffered from a cascade of catastrophic birth defects. The pointed, skull-like head was the result of a severe form of pterocephaly, where the cranial sutures fused prematurely, forcing the skull to grow upwards. Her tiny size was a form of primordial dwarfism. The lack of a navel, the strange joints, the malformed organs, each bizarre feature that had fueled the alien speculation was traced back to a specific, identifiable genetic mutation. But it wasn't just one mutation, or two, or even 10. The analysis identified at least 20 distinct, severe genetic mutations. It was a perfect storm of developmental failures. A human being could potentially survive one or two of these conditions. But 20? It was a biological impossibility. The scientists concluded that the child was born prematurely, likely at around 25 weeks, and that it was a miracle she had survived for even a few weeks. Her body was, from the moment of conception, fundamentally incompatible with life. The mystery of what Alyoshenka was had been solved. She was human, a tragically deformed human infant. But this solution only opened the door to a much darker and more disturbing question. Why? Why would a single child in this one specific place be born with such an unprecedented cluster of genetic abnormalities? A single random mutation is a tragedy of chance. 20 is a pattern. It's an indictment. And the scientists didn't have to look far for the prime suspect. They just had to look at a map. The town where Tamara Prosperina found the tiny creature. The town that sits in the shadow of the Mayak plutonium plant. The town that was at the epicenter of the 1957 Kyshtym disaster. One of the worst nuclear accidents in human history. An event so catastrophic it was rated a level 6 on the International Nuclear Event Scale. Only Chernobyl and Fukushima have been rated higher. For decades, the Mayak plant had been dumping highly radioactive waste directly into the Teka River, the primary water source for tens of thousands of people. The 1957 explosion was just the most dramatic event in a long slow-motion poisoning of the entire region. The geneticists in Moscow could now draw a direct, terrifying line from the Cold War's reckless nuclear ambitions to the tiny mummified body on their lab table. The radiation that had saturated the soil, the water, and the air around Kyshtym for 40 years had done exactly what radiation does. It had shattered DNA. The chaotic, fragmented, and broken genetic code of Alyoshenka was a direct reflection of the poisoned environment she was conceived in. The truth was more shocking than any alien fantasy. Alyoshenka wasn't a visitor from the stars. She was a ghost of the atomic age. She wasn't a messenger from another world. She was a victim of our own. The answer to the Kyshtym mystery wasn't written in the sky. It was written in the chromosomes of a lost child. A child whose very biology was a silent scream, a testament to a state-sponsored secret, and an environmental catastrophe that continued to claim victims, even decades later. The search for an alien had ended with the discovery of an unthinkable human tragedy. The scientific investigation was over, but the story was not. Because with this new, terrible knowledge, the questions only became more urgent. Who were her parents? Did they know what they had given birth to? And most importantly, what happened to Alyoshenka's body after the tests were complete? The truth was out, but the evidence, the tiny body itself, was about to vanish. The body, the one piece of irrefutable evidence in a case spiraling into madness, was kept in a refrigerator in the police department's morgue. The officer in charge of the investigation was a man named Major Vladimir Bendlin. Bendlin wasn't a UFO hunter or a conspiracy theorist. He was a cop, a practical man dealing with a very impractical situation. He had initiated a criminal investigation, not into an alien landing, but into the unknown identity of a possible child. He had the body, he had Tamara Prosperina's testimony, and he was trying to follow procedure. But word was spreading like wildfire. The local press had caught wind of the Kyshtym alien, and soon the story was attracting attention from all over Russia. This wasn't just local gossip anymore. It was a national sensation. And with that fame came a new, unpredictable element: the ufologists. A group calling themselves the Star Academy of UFO Contact by the Ural method descended upon Kyshtym. They were led by a charismatic and intensely focused woman named Galina Semenkova. To Semenkova and her followers, Alyoshenka wasn't a medical mystery or a police case. It was a miracle. It was first contact. They believed this tiny creature was a celestial being, a star child, and that the clumsy, skeptical hands of the authorities were desecrating a sacred object. They approached Major Bendlin, pleading with him to turn the body over to them. They argued that they, not the police or medical examiners, were the only ones who could truly understand what Alyoshenka was. They promised to conduct their own, more enlightened analysis. Bendlin, a man of the law, initially refused. This was evidence in an ongoing investigation. You don't just hand evidence over to a civilian group with esoteric beliefs. But the pressure was immense. The case was bizarre. He was getting no clear answers from the medical establishment, and here was a group offering to take this problem off his hands. The exact details of what happened next are fiercely debated. Some accounts say Semenkova and her group simply stole the body. The more common version of the story, however, is that Bendlin, seeing his official investigation going nowhere and perhaps being persuaded by the group's sheer conviction, relented. He unofficially handed over the mummified remains of Alyoshenka to Galina Semenkova. He made one crucial decision before doing so, though. He filmed it. He took out his own video camera and documented the tiny body from every angle, preserving the only record he would have left. It was a choice that would prove to be absolutely vital. With their precious aliens secured, Semenkova and the Star Academy left Kyshtym. They believed they were protecting a cosmic secret. They were now the custodians of the most important discovery in human history. For weeks, the body of Alyoshenka traveled with them. It was examined, revered, and treated like a holy relic. Semenkova was convinced she could communicate with the being's spirit, that it was a scout from a distant star system. The plan was to take the body to Moscow, to present it to the world's leading experts and finally get the validation they craved. But Alyoshenka would never make it to Moscow. The story takes its most dramatic and unbelievable turn on a dark highway somewhere outside of Kyshtym. According to Galina Semenkova's own account, she was transporting the body in her car one night when a strange event occurred. Bright lights suddenly filled the sky above the road. Her car engine died. A massive, silent, saucer-shaped craft descended from the heavens and hovered directly over her vehicle. She claimed that beings from the craft telepathically communicated with her. They told her they had come to reclaim their lost comrade. And just like that, the body of Alyoshenka was taken. It vanished from her car, beamed aboard the ship, which then ascended and disappeared into the night sky, leaving a terrified and dumbfounded Galina Semenkova alone on a dark road. When she finally managed to get to a town and report what happened, her story was met with disbelief, even ridicule. To the authorities, it sounded like a convenient, self-serving fantasy. Major Bendlin was furious. The single most important piece of evidence in his bizarre case was now gone, lost to a story about a flying saucer. He was left with nothing but his notes, a few photographs, and the videotape he had wisely shot. The official investigation was, for all intents and purposes, over. The trail had gone cold in the most spectacular way imaginable. The body was gone. Tamara Prosperina was dead. The primary evidence and the primary witness had both vanished from the world. All that remained were conflicting stories, grainy video footage, and a town haunted by the memory of a tiny, strange creature. The case of the Kyshtym Dwarf seemed destined to become just another piece of UFO folklore. A wild tale with no proof. But it wasn't quite over. Because while the body itself was lost forever, something had been left behind. Something small, almost insignificant, that had been overlooked in the chaos. Back in Kyshtym, before the body had been handed over, the initial pathologist who had examined Alyoshenka had kept the small, stained piece of cloth the creature had been wrapped in. And on that cloth were traces of biological material. Blood, skin cells, genetic matter. Years later, as the legend grew, scientists from the Vavilov Institute of General Genetics in Moscow became interested. They heard the stories, saw Bendlin's video, and wanted to apply modern science to this cold case. They couldn't analyze the body, but maybe, just maybe, they could analyze what was left on that cloth. They managed to track down the original samples. For the first time, DNA sequencing technology, something that was unavailable in that small Siberian town in 1996, was about to be brought to bear on the mystery of Alyoshenka. The debate had always been a simple one. Was it a human fetus or was it an alien? The believers pointed to the strange head, the lack of a navel, the bizarre features. The skeptics pointed to the tragedy of a premature birth and the power of suggestion. For years, it was one person's word against another's. But DNA doesn't have an opinion. It doesn't believe in UFOs, and it doesn't care about folklore. It simply tells a story written in a code of 4 letters. The scientists extracted the remaining genetic material from that forgotten piece of cloth. The answer to the entire Kyshtym mystery, the truth of what Tamara Prosperina found in the woods that day, was finally within reach. And the results of that genetic analysis would be more shocking than anyone could have predicted. The Institute of General Genetics in Moscow, a place where the building blocks of life are decoded every single day. But the sample they received in 2003 was unlike any other. It wasn't a blood vial or a sterile swab. It was a dusty, forgotten piece of fabric, stained with a microscopic amount of biological material from a creature that had been dead for 7 years. A creature some called an alien and others a hoax. For Dr. Vadim Chernobrov and the researchers at Cosmopoisk, this was the moment of truth. Years of chasing rumors, interviewing witnesses, and hitting dead ends had all led to this. The fate of the Alyoshenka legend rested on the fragile, degraded DNA strands clinging to that cloth. The first challenge was immense. Extracting a viable genetic profile from such a tiny, old, and contaminated sample is like trying to reassemble a single shredded page from a library that's been through a hurricane. The risk of contamination from anyone who had ever handled the cloth was enormous. The DNA could be a meaningless soup of genetic information from dozens of different people. The scientists at the Vavilov Institute of General Genetics had to use the most advanced techniques available, painstakingly isolating the target DNA from all the modern-day noise. They focused first on mitochondrial DNA. Think of it as a genetic echo passed down almost unchanged from mother to child. It's more abundant and robust than nuclear DNA, making it the best bet for getting a result from a degraded sample. Weeks turned into months. The world of ufology held its breath. The initial reports that trickled out were confusing, contradictory, and only added fuel to the fire. Some early analyses were rumored to have come back with the stunning conclusion: the DNA did not match any known species on Earth. The story exploded. News outlets ran with headlines proclaiming Russian scientists find alien DNA. For believers, this was the ultimate validation. The smoking gun. Proof that we are not alone, and that a tiny tragic visitor had briefly lived in a remote town in the Urals. But in the world of genetics, the phrase "does not match" can be dangerously misleading. It can simply mean the sample was too degraded, too contaminated, or that the specific markers they were looking for weren't present. It doesn't automatically mean alien. The real definitive analysis was still underway. The team, led by Dr. V.V. Skuratov, wasn't satisfied with the ambiguous early results. They pushed forward, managing to sequence not just the mitochondrial DNA, but also parts of the far more complex nuclear DNA, the full genetic blueprint of the organism. And when those results were finally compiled and cross-referenced, the shocking truth emerged. It was a truth that was, in its own way, far more complex and far more tragic than any story about a stranded extraterrestrial. The mitochondrial DNA was conclusive. It was human. 100%. It belonged to the haplogroup H, a genetic group that is extremely common in Eastern Europe and the region around Kyshtym. This meant that the creature, Alyoshenka, was not only human, but was born to a local woman from that area. The alien hypothesis, the idea of a visitor from another world, was shattered in an instant. But this answer only created a bigger, more disturbing question. If Alyoshenka was a human child, what on earth could have made it look like that? How could a human being have a towering pointed skull, huge eyes, and a body barely 10 inches long? The answer wasn't in the stars. It was hidden in the catastrophic errors of its own genetic code. The nuclear DNA analysis told the rest of the story. It revealed a cascade of devastating genetic mutations. The scientists identified at least 4 major genetic abnormalities that, when combined, would have resulted in the extreme deformities witnessed by everyone who saw Alyoshenka. The elongated, pear-shaped skull was not an alien trait. It was the result of a severe congenital malformation, likely a form of pterocephaly, where the cranial sutures fused prematurely, forcing the skull to grow upwards instead of outwards. The lack of a navel, the underdeveloped limbs, the strange joints, all of it could be explained by a host of severe skeletal dysplasia and developmental disorders. This wasn't an alien. This was a human female fetus, likely born prematurely at around 20 to 25 weeks of gestation. And she had been dealt the unluckiest genetic hand imaginable. The Kyshtym region, as we know, is a place scarred by nuclear disaster. The 1957 explosion at the Mayak plutonium plant, just a few miles away, was one of the worst radiological accidents in history, blanketing the area in a plume of radioactive isotopes. For decades, the people there have suffered from elevated rates of cancer, birth defects, and genetic mutations. The water, the soil, the very air they breathed was poisoned. Alyoshenka, it seemed, was one of its most tragic victims. A child whose DNA was scrambled before she ever had a chance at life. Suddenly, the entire story shifts. The lens changes from one of sci-fi wonder to one of profound human tragedy. Think back to Tamara Prosperina, an elderly woman suffering from severe mental illness, living alone, likely forgotten by society. She wanders into the woods, a place contaminated by nuclear fallout. And there she finds a tiny, gasping, severely deformed premature baby, abandoned and left to die. In her delusional state, she doesn't see a medical crisis. Her lonely maternal mind fills in the blanks. She sees a child. Her child. Alyoshenka. She takes it home, wraps it in cloth, and tries to feed it, to care for it. She gives it a name and all the love her broken mind can muster. The stories from her daughter-in-law and neighbors now make perfect, heartbreaking sense. The little sweets and caramels she tried to feed it. Her frantic, protective behavior. She wasn't nurturing an alien. She was a mentally ill grandmother trying to care for a dying human infant she couldn't possibly understand. The creature's silence, its inability to eat, its strange little squeaking sounds, these weren't the behaviors of an extraterrestrial. They were the signs of a non-viable human fetus, born with catastrophic defects, with underdeveloped lungs and organs, slowly shutting down. And then the authorities step in. The paramedics, the police. They see the reality. They see a mentally unstable woman with a bizarre mummified thing. They don't see an alien. They see a potential crime scene. They see a public health issue. They confiscate the body, not to hide evidence of alien life from the world, but to investigate a potential case of illegal abortion, infanticide, or desecration of a corpse. The local investigator, Vladimir Bendlin, who held onto the body, wasn't trying to make contact with a new species. He was a small-town cop who was completely out of his depth, confronted with something so medically bizarre he couldn't explain it. So he held on to it, hoping anyone could tell him what it was. The genetic analysis recontextualizes every single bizarre detail of the story. The UFOs seen in the sky? The Urals are a hotbed for military activity and rocket launches. Sightings are common. The supposed psychic abilities? Anecdotes filtered through the lens of people who wanted to believe. Every supernatural element evaporates in the face of the scientific and medical reality. The truth of the Kyshtym Dwarf isn't a story about aliens. It's a story about human suffering on every possible level. The suffering of a child born with unimaginable defects. The suffering of a mother who either abandoned her baby or was a victim of the region's poisoned legacy herself. And the suffering of a lonely, mentally ill old woman who found a purpose in caring for a dying infant, only to have it ripped away from her before she herself met a tragic and mysterious end. The DNA provided the what? Alyoshenka was human, but in doing so, it opened up a far more haunting set of questions. Who was she? Who was her mother? And what really happened to the tiny mummified body that set this entire tragic story in motion? To find the truth about Alyoshenka, we first have to follow the body. It was last seen in the hands of a pathologist, Stanislav Samishkin, who conducted the initial informal autopsy. He concluded it was a human fetus. From there, the trail goes cold. One version of the story, championed by the ufologists from Cosmopoisk, is that the police, fearing the body would be stolen, hid it. But when they went to retrieve it, the body was gone. An officer allegedly claimed that a UFO had been seen hovering over the hospital that night, implying a celestial retrieval. A convenient story, perhaps, for someone who simply misplaced a key piece of evidence. Another, more sinister theory points to Russia's Federal Security Service, the FSB. The idea is that government agents, realizing the international attention this alien was attracting, confiscated the body. Why? Perhaps to prevent a panic. Or more chillingly, to hide the evidence of what Alyoshenka truly represented. A terrifying legacy of the Soviet Union's darkest nuclear secrets. The body in this scenario is likely locked away in some forgotten archive, a classified specimen never to be seen again. Then there's the simplest and perhaps most likely explanation. The body was evidence in a minor local case. It was an unidentified human fetus. After the initial examination with no crime suspected, it was simply lost. Lost in the shuffle of a small-town Russian morgue's bureaucracy, possibly disposed of as unclaimed biological material. There was no grand conspiracy, no alien retrieval, just mundane human error. The truth is, we will likely never know for certain what happened to the physical remains of Alyoshenka. The body vanished, leaving behind only a myth. But the DNA test didn't vanish. It gave us an anchor in reality. Alyoshenka was a human female. This forces us to confront the most heartbreaking part of the story. Her mother. Who was she? While no one was ever officially identified, local rumors and unofficial investigations point to a plausible and deeply tragic scenario. The story goes that a young, mentally unwell woman, possibly a student at a local technical school, had a secret, unwanted pregnancy. In a state of panic and denial, she gave birth prematurely, alone. The baby that emerged was not healthy. It was tiny, frail, and severely deformed. Terrified, ashamed, and possibly suffering from postpartum psychosis, she abandoned the infant in the woods near the village cemetery, hoping it would never be found. She was not a monster. She was likely a frightened girl, trapped by circumstance, who made a terrible decision. This is where Tamara Prosperina enters the story, a woman plagued by her own severe mental illness, living in a world of delusions. For her, finding this strange-looking creature wasn't a tragedy. It was a miracle. Her mind, unable to process the reality of a deformed human baby, created a new narrative. This wasn't an abandoned child. It was a gift from the stars, a little alien she would name Alyoshenka. The telepathic commands she heard were not from a spaceship. They were the echoes of her own fractured psyche. She fed the baby condensed milk and water, not because she was cruel, but because it was the only way she knew how to care for this tiny being that she genuinely seemed to love. Alyoshenka's death wasn't a cosmic event. It was the inevitable outcome for a premature, severely ill infant receiving improper care. Tamara's story, too, ends in tragedy. 2 years after Alyoshenka's death, just as she was scheduled to give a television interview about her experience, she was struck and killed by a car in a hit-and-run. For conspiracy theorists, this was the ultimate proof. She was silenced before she could reveal the full truth. For everyone else, it was a sad, cruel coincidence. A mentally ill woman prone to wandering aimlessly met a tragic end on a dark road. But even if we accept this human story, a troubled mother, a delusional caregiver, it still doesn't answer the most fundamental question. Why did Alyoshenka look the way she did? The elongated, 20-bone skull, the lack of a navel, the strange joints. These aren't typical human features. The answer to that doesn't lie in the stars, but in the very soil of Kyshtym itself. Kyshtym is not just some random town in the Ural Mountains. It sits in the shadow of one of the most catastrophic nuclear disasters in human history, an event many people have never even heard of. In 1957, at the Mayak plutonium plant just a few miles away, a poorly maintained storage tank containing 80 tons of liquid nuclear waste exploded. The blast, equivalent to 70 tons of TNT, was not a nuclear explosion, but it was a radiological one. It released a plume of radioactive isotopes that contaminated over 20,000 square kilometers, an area known today as the East Ural Radioactive Trace. For comparison, the Chernobyl disaster released about 50 million curies of radiation. The Kyshtym disaster released 20 million. It was a secret disaster. The Soviet government covered it up for over 30 years. Villages were bulldozed, their residents relocated without explanation. The people who remained in towns like Kyshtym continued to live on poisoned land, drink poisoned water, and eat poisoned food, completely unaware of the invisible danger that surrounded them. The effects were devastating. Cancer rates skyrocketed. And, most importantly for our story, there was a dramatic increase in birth defects. Radiation is a teratogen, an agent that can cause malformations in an embryo or fetus. The specific kind of catastrophic, skeletal deformities seen in Alyoshenka, like anencephaly or severe hydrocephalus, which can elongate the skull, are known consequences of intense radiation exposure during pregnancy. Suddenly, all the pieces fall into place. The alien body is no longer alien. It is the body of a human child, a female fetus born prematurely in the late 1990s. Her mother was likely a young woman who grew up in the contaminated zone around the Mayak plant. The alien features, the misshapen skull, the underdeveloped body, were not signs of an extraterrestrial origin. They were the horrific scars of a terrestrial poison, the tragic birthmarks of the atomic age. The Kyshtym Dwarf was never an alien. She was a victim of a secret nuclear catastrophe, a victim of a government that valued secrecy over the lives of its citizens. and a victim of a world that was so eager to believe in a fantasy from outer space that it overlooked a horrifying reality right here on Earth. The story of Alyoshenka is a perfect storm of human tragedy. It's a story of environmental disaster, of mental illness, of poverty, and of our own innate desire to find wonder and meaning in the unexplained. The alien narrative was exciting, it was mysterious, it was an adventure. The truth is far more bleak. It's a story about a sick baby, born of a likely terrified mother, found by a lonely, delusional woman, in a town poisoned by its own country. In the end, the question isn't whether Alyoshenka was real. She was. The question is what she represents. For some, she will always be a visitor from another world, a mystery that was lost or stolen before it could be solved. But perhaps the real story is more important. Alyoshenka is a ghost of the Cold War, a tiny silent witness to the devastating, long-lasting consequences of our own self-destructive power. The search for aliens in the stars can be a profound distraction from the very real monsters we create right here on Earth. And the story of the Kyshtym Dwarf isn't a story about what might be out there. It's a heartbreaking warning about who we are.